Let's talk about drugs, the performance-enhancing kinds. It seems quite safe to say that sports in general are filled with them, for better or for worse. So it seems to follow that it may be beneficial to take a closer look at the drugs themselves and see if there is perhaps a safer way to navigate through their use. Before we begin, I just need to make a disclaimer that this is not medical advice and you should not take any of it as such. This is simply a discussion of existing evidence and material. Secondly, I am not promoting the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sports, where it is theoretically against the rules. Instead, what I am trying to do here is outline an idealized structure for a person who wants to train and become good at arm wrestling as a training and performance modality with a focus on efficiency and safety. So this will certainly not be a guide on how to get as big and bloated as quickly as possible, because for everybody except perhaps super heavyweights, the downsides of that method usually outweigh the positives. The goal is to support a healthy, technical, powerful and strong athlete, not a bodybuilder. So to start, I'll straight up say what I think are the best choices of compounds for this. Long-term, maximal effective dose of testosterone until side effects emerge, with Stanozolol aka Winstrol thrown on top for periods of extra strength gain. It's not fancy, and there are certainly more drugs you could take on top of that and potentially see more results, but I feel that these two compounds are going to provide the large majority of what you actually need, without exposing you to excessive levels of danger from use. So let's start with testosterone. Testosterone is about as simple an anabolic steroid as you can use. It is an almost perfect synthetic replicant of what you should ordinarily have circulating around your body, whereas other steroids like Trenbolone are not quite as similar, and with testosterone being so popular in actual clinical use, we have far more documentation surrounding it to analyze for benefits and risks. But what does testosterone do, and why would we need it? Testosterone regulates libido, bone mass, fat distribution, muscle mass and strength, the production of red blood cells and reproductive functions. With higher levels, the degree of those functions all increase, so a naturally higher level testosterone person, like a male, is going to have more muscle mass and strength than a lower testosterone person, like a female. And if we increase the levels of testosterone exogenously with outside sources, the vast majority of those functions increase further than possible naturally. That sounds good, so theoretically we can just dose more and more testosterone and be the best arm wrestler there is. However, we know most sports, even arm wrestling, are not sports purely dependent on having bigger or stronger muscles, which is why most elite athletes, even ones using PEDs, are typically much less muscular than a bodybuilder. And bodybuilders, despite their sheer size, are usually not as proportionally strong as you might expect. Strength, also known as force production, is a combination of muscle tissue, connective tissue, bone density, neurological, proportional, and hormonal abilities. Of those requirements, testosterone will only majorly impact the muscular, bone, and hormonal abilities. In arm wrestling especially, connective tissue strength is very important due to the heavy static strength requirements it very frequently asks for. And unfortunately, there is some evidence that the use of anabolic steroids may actually disrupt the strength of tendons, with excess use potentially linked to ruptures of the bicep tendon in particular, although there is still a strong lack of concrete information about the exact reasons for this. For example, people in general who do use anabolic steroids are far more likely to be performing activities that place more strain on the bicep tendons, like lifting heavier weights, which would quite easily provide some reason for the higher rate of tendon ruptures. In regards to neurological ability, again, testosterone in a healthy dose is essential to general mental well-being, with low testosterone being clearly linked to poor mental health. But again, more testosterone past the point is not correlated with better neurological or mental ability, and as we will get to later, excess amounts of almost all anabolic steroids have quite strong evidence of being neurotoxic and deleterious to mental function. So for an athlete not trying to grow bigger in extremes, exogenous testosterone is starting to seem like it lacks purpose. And in fact, if purely strength gains with no regard to general health and future function is the goal, we can actually use other anabolic steroids without including testosterone, as many people do. But retaining that general health and future function is why testosterone remains an important part of this system. All anabolic agents, including SARMs, will suppress or even shut down the natural production of testosterone via the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. As we have said before, having low levels of testosterone is definitely not a good thing, especially for athletic performance. So by introducing this baseline of testosterone, despite its source being exogenous, we allowed the body to continue along with its natural processes, although by introducing this exogenously, we still had to sacrifice some functions being impacted, like fertility, on account of the shutdown. If we were only going to use a level of testosterone that only mimicked the natural amount, then you would be right in assuming it has very little purpose or benefit, since we essentially just made a hole in the bucket for the sole purpose of patching it up again while introducing weak points. However, having a more direct control over the testosterone circulating provides us with a few advantages over the normal production. We can quite easily directly alter the amount that is circulating by increasing or decreasing the dose at will. But like many things in the body, testosterone is not an inert, non-influential product that can be adjusted without repercussions. Like most things in the body, testosterone is acting as a halfway product, performing some functions itself, but also waiting to be converted into something else. And this outlines one of the major problems with experiments on the human body. Nobody, not even the most educated or experienced doctors, have a fully mapped and infallible understanding of each and every process taking place in the body. So when you introduce new variables into the cacophony of processes, it is important to try and tread as lightly as possible so that you don't upset things more than you have to. And this means, unfortunately, that the vast majority of people telling you that taking Trenbolone is safe, or that GHRP6 or X-SARM is best at a certain point of the day, are more often than not either operating from blind or unstable platforms of information, or just making things up for content. And this has been an issue with the field of PEDs as we are discussing their use, because there has been next to no actual large-scale clinical trials done on them that give us conclusive directions to the use of all of them. Instead, we often ask the biggest guy in the gym what he uses. So assuming we do want to tread as lightly as possible, sticking as close to more verified information and doing as little damage as possible, testosterone seems like a good place to start since it is so well documented and understood. And one thing we know about testosterone is that it being a cholesterol-based steroid follows a path of conversion to and from other steroids in the body. Is this really essential to know? No, not really. Many people do get away with it just fine without knowing what is going on when they take steroids. But since you are watching this to this point, I think you care at least a little bit about what is going on. This picture may look a bit overwhelming, but let's walk through it step by step and it should make more sense. The process of steroidogenesis, the creation of steroids in the human body, begins with cholesterol, which can be gained from the cells, from stored lipids, or from the uptake of HDL or LDL cholesterol in the bloodstream. Cholesterol is then converted into a progestogen, which are a group of steroids closely linked with pregnancy-related functions, one of which is progesterone. To take a slight detour with this, while progesterone would not ordinarily be a steroid we care about for strength and muscle hypertrophy, Trenbolone binds with high affinity to the progesterone receptor, despite it being commonly thought of as just an anabolic androgenic steroid, which allows it to very easily produce some of the same changes that ordinary progesterone would. A few of the responsibilities of progesterone are regulation of skin elasticity, firmness and strength, regulation of libido, higher levels producing breast swelling and tenderness, weight gain, depression, fatigue, anxiety, bloating, and high levels of progesterone have also been linked with higher homoerotic motivation scores. Both excess and deficits of progesterone activity in men and women is associated with increased risk of addictive tendencies, and there are many other responsibilities, but you can see how simply taking one anabolic steroid actually initiates a whole cascade of bodily functions in response that you probably weren't aware of. Back to steroidogenesis. In the presence of the enzymes 17-alpha hydroxylase and 17-20-lyase, progestogens then convert into the androgens most of us are interested in, or in the presence of other enzymes they can convert instead into mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, which regulates salt, water and blood pressure, or glucocorticoids like cortisol, which you probably know as a hormone associated with stress, but it also helps to increase sugar in the blood and aid in the metabolism of fat, protein and carbohydrates. Within the androgens group, we have dihydroepiandrosterone, which converts into androstenediol or androstenedione, which can both convert into testosterone, which in turn can convert into dihydrotestosterone, also known as DHT. Androstenedione and testosterone also have the ability to convert into another group of steroids, the estrogens. So you can see here that if you simply increase the amount of testosterone circulating in the bloodstream, you increase the chances of those downstream hormones being created too, which both reduces the amount of testosterone for the purposes you wanted, but also introduces new categories of potential issues. DHT is well documented as a high potentiator for things like hair loss, prostate growth, oily skin, which can lead to acne, bodily hair growth, and in women, genitalia growth and stopping of menstrual cycles, as DHT is a highly androgenically active steroid, which generally implies a pushing towards a more masculine environment. Excess estrogens too bring a lot of issues. It can cause infertility, gynecomastia, mood swings, headaches, sleep disturbance, irritability, thyroid disorders, breast cysts, reproductive organ issues, gallbladder disease, and many other things. None of these things are particularly useful for gaining muscle and strength, but they are very real risks of the pursuit of that. In response, many people have realized that this conversion depends on the presence of those enzymes, 5-alpha reductase and aromatase, so why not just remove those entirely? And they do, through further medication on top of the prior medication which causes the disturbance. To combat DHT production, 5-alpha reductase inhibitors like finasteride and dutasteride are deployed, most commonly known as attempts to reduce male pattern baldness, which is usually blamed on excess levels of DHT. And against estrogen, aromatase inhibitors are used, like tamoxifen or anastrozole. But then more issues often arise as a response to the deficiency of those hormones you have just blocked. Side effects of DHT deficiency include decreased fertility, sexual function and libido, fatigue, depression, breast enlargement and tenderness, confusion, breathing difficulties, weakness, breast cancer in males, and other unpleasant things. Estrogen deficiency can cause things like osteoporosis or lack of bone density, which for arm wrestling presents a very real risk, sexual dysfunction, weight gain, and mood swings, to name a few. And this is in adults who are more or less hormonally stable. In pubertal or prepubertal people, these issues become much more physically and mentally altering, like stunted growth, gender dysphoria, abnormal genitalia, early puberty or lack of puberty, and all kinds of other problems that will persist into adulthood. So in attempts for safer use, we really want to err on the side of minimal effective dose for the vast majority of the time, and ideally not be cycling the drugs on and off, despite what many people have said about the benefits of doing so. In clinical use of anabolic steroids, there is no cycling on and off because almost always, the issue is that the hormone being replaced is deficient when not supplemented. The vast majority of people watching videos like this are not going to be clinically deficient. Instead, they want to gain extra performance from an excess level of these hormones. As we said before, using these hormones either for clinical replacement or performance enhancement is going to suppress or shut down the natural supply, both with anabolic androgenic steroids or selective androgen receptor modulators. The body simply sees an excess of androgen activity and responds by reducing the production. So what this means is that when you cycle on and off, you end up with periods of high levels of hormones and then periods of low or none of those hormones while you wait for the body to bring back its own production, during which time you have to endure the effects that deficiencies of those hormones bring. You can attempt to take more drugs alongside the hormones like HCG to try and keep the body functioning despite this surplus, but that is not guaranteed in every individual and means you have to take more and more drugs and pay more money. This is why, like the clinical method, a lifetime therapy of testosterone is probably the safer option if you intend to use testosterone, assuming the dose is not extreme. And these extreme doses are where the side effects we've talked about begin to appear in force. So logically, it seems to make sense that if you are committed to a lifetime use of testosterone, you are in it for the long haul and not aiming at blowing up in size in a short amount of time. And since we are talking about performance enhancement for a sport which does not require size, we don't have any real need to blow up into the next Ronnie Coleman at all. So rather than the active agent in this system, we should look at testosterone as the baseline that allows you to perform at an optimal level without falling into periods of catabolism or overtraining as easily as you would naturally, and as a platform from where you are more cleanly able to introduce other agents on top without disrupting the internal well-being more than necessary. So where do we go from here? Do we even need to? No, you could get along very well with just a lower dose of testosterone enhancing all of your facilities, but not pushed to a level that brings more problems than needed. But in terms of gaining pure strength, testosterone alone is not quite as optimal as we would like. If we look at what studies seem to say is more directly responsible for increased force production, we can see that DHT seems to play a very direct role. While muscle size can be well attributed to testosterone levels, due to the free access of testosterone to the androgen receptors across them, the required enzyme 5-alpha reductase for conversion of testosterone into DHT is almost non-existent in skeletal muscle tissue. However, in many other parts of the body, like scalp hair follicles, prostate tissue, facial and bodily hair follicles, the ability for DHT to bind to the androgen receptors is much higher due to the saturation of that enzyme in those areas. And DHT itself is a much more potent androgen than testosterone, and binds to the androgen receptors to perform the activities within that cell about 3 to 5 times as aggressively as testosterone would. And one of the most important areas for force production, beyond just the mechanical strength that muscle tissue provides, is the central nervous system, or CNS, of which there are many androgen receptors to be found within, which DHT can bind to with much more potency than testosterone alone. The CNS is the almost literal backbone of movement, essentially responsible for transmitting signals to and from the brain to the rest of the body. Training for pure strength then involves much more CNS training and conditioning than simply building muscle tissue, and this is why the vast majority of strength-focused athletes are not necessarily as muscular as a bodybuilder. If we look at the training of a powerlifter or weightlifter, the vast majority of it revolves around lifting as heavy a weight as possible a few times, or even just once, resting and then repeating this until the CNS is exhausted, then recovering, then repeating this process. And this training is only seen as different to the training of a sprinter or jumper or marathon runner or arm wrestler because those sports do not implicitly revolve around lifting weights. However, all physical sports do revolve at some level around the body overcoming some form of resistance, whether that be a sprinter having to push against the ground explosively, or a jumper doing the same thing but in a different vector, or an arm wrestler having to overcome the opponent, or a marathon runner having to do what a sprinter does but for a much longer period of time. So this is why for the vast majority of people, sport-specific training or simply doing the sport itself as much as possible in correct ways, while allowing the body, specifically the CNS, to recover, is going to yield the vast majority of possible results within that sport in the shortest amount of time. Much like a pianist is probably going to become a better pianist more through specifically playing the piano than reading music theory alone. The body does not really know or understand things, it just remembers what it has done and reshapes itself in attempts to better tolerate the stress that activity places on it. So doing this type of training whilst in an environment of enriched DHT levels is going to allow much more activity in the androgen receptors within the central nervous system, which is going to essentially be boosting the body's ability to learn, adapt and reform itself to better respond to the stress placed upon it. If you wanted to picture a prototypical high DHT level person, they will probably have these features: high levels of strength without necessarily large amounts of muscle mass, fast, precise movements delivered with a lot of force in a short amount of time, very fast reflexes, potential predisposition to male pattern baldness, high levels of bodily hair, oily skin and acne prone. I'm sure you can imagine a few people or groups of people who seem to fit this description naturally. Let's look again at the androgen map. You can see that DHT sits in a sort of cul-de-sac of production after testosterone and does not possess the ability to convert further into any other hormone, which makes it quite a clean hormone to start from. DHT itself being high may bring some side effects as we said before, but we can be pretty confident that the side effects it brings are dependent on its presence and the dosage of it, rather than it changing and pushing buttons elsewhere that we can't see. So if we can limit the testosterone to a dose that does not produce excess conversion into estrogens or DHT, we limit the wildcard side effects, but may run into limitations of performance enhancement. So instead of adding more testosterone or testosterone-based compounds on top of that, why not introduce DHT-derived compounds that do not provide any risks beyond their own specific impacts? Yes, steroids like methandienone, aka Anadrol, which are derived from testosterone, will improve strength. However, that is very likely because the drug has a high affinity for the androgen receptors, much like DHT does, and those drugs being testosterone derived will eventually convert into DHT anyway. However, methandionone, being testosterone derived, is also a substrate for aromatase and can be quite easily metabolized into estrogens, which, as you probably know, brings about the famous anabolic bloat or moon phase from water retention, as well as all the other effects of excess estrogen we already mentioned. Whereas a DHT-based substance would be fundamentally unable to proceed down those pathways of further conversion, but still retains the androgen binding benefits. So what DHT derivative steroids are actually available? There are a lot of compounds here, but many of them are of no interest since they're not available in the first place. The ones we care about are the 17-alpha alkylated derivatives, which simply means they have been structurally altered to be orally active, not specifically because they have to be orally active, but because they are essentially the only steroids actually available. And from those, we don't want to bother with non-marketed candidates, since they have almost no real-world testing, except perhaps methasterone, also known as Superdrol, which was available briefly legally as a supplement until the FDA prohibited its production in 2006. From the remaining, the last three are the ones we are interested in, since the others are either similar to them or too obscure to realistically obtain. Oxandrolone, which you might know as Anavar, Oxymetholone aka Anadrol, and Stanozolol, commonly called Winstrol. Oxandrolone is a very well tolerated steroid since it, like most other steroids, were created as potential alternatives to testosterone with less side effects, usually focusing on reduced androgenic issues like virilization in females. While very popular and well documented in clinical use, oxandrolone is also relatively expensive and often faked with one of the other two if the source is not pharmaceutical. And as of 2023, obtaining legitimate Anavar may become more difficult since the pharmaceutical production of Anavar for medical use in the USA has been stopped by the FDA. On top of this, since the vast majority of people in the sport of arm wrestling are not female, the milder side effects of Anavar may have reduced benefits, which combined with the price and difficulty obtaining legitimate supplies removes some of its viability. The second option is Oxymetholone or Anadrol. This one is very popular among strength requiring sports since it works well and is often regarded as one of the strongest and most powerful anabolic steroids available for medical use. And it is well represented as being highly competent at packing on extensive gains in body mass, so it is very popular with bodybuilders, but that is not specifically the goal we are looking for here. Anadrol is a DHT derivative and possesses no routes for further conversions into estrogens or any other hormone. However, uniquely to Anadrol amongst DHT derivatives, there is an association still with relatively high estrogen activity, which introduces the risks of side effects like gynecomastia and water retention, possibly because the drug may bind directly to and activate the estrogen receptors despite not actually converting into an estrogen, much like as we said before about Trenbolone and progesterone receptors. On top of this, Anadrol seems especially able to rapidly increase the amount of red blood cells in the bloodstream, even more so than other steroids, which is going to rapidly increase the blood pressure, which is very often not ideal for general well-being. So Anadrol may work, but it does present a few more side effects that someone aiming for longevity and efficiency may want to avoid. Which leaves us with Stanozolol, also known as Winstrol, although Winstrol was a specific brand of the drug which as of 2014 does not seem to be on the legitimate market anymore directly from a pharmaceutical source. The drug itself, Stanozolol, also seems to be lacking in pharmaceutical production, but it can be produced in smaller compounding pharmacies who produce specific small quantities for individual patient needs, so you may be able to find a legitimate production in some territories. The main modern legitimately produced form of Stanozolol is created for veterinary purposes both as injectable and oral forms. If you search online, you will find a lot of people advertising the drug as Winstrol. If they do, then there are very high chances that the drug being sold is not from a legitimate source, since all of the current legitimate sources will call the drug by its generic name of Stanozolol, or Stromber for European production, although even this is no guarantee of quality because underground labs will quite easily just create packaging with those seemingly legitimate names on them. So unless you're getting the drug directly from a pharmacy or doctor, it is very difficult to tell the quality without testing it. However, Stanozolol itself is a relatively simple compound and fairly cheap, so is not often faked. In fact, it is often the other more expensive drugs like Anavar, which are switched with Stanozolol to increase profits, which for males might not be an issue, but for females invites potentially unwanted side effects despite best intentions. So the overall risk of fake Stanozolol is relatively low compared to other compounds. So, stanozolol being a cheaper, potentially more reliable DHT derivative more directly implicated in strength gains seems potentially useful. What else is there to know about it? Unlike Anadrol, which has a high tendency to produce water retention in the body, stanozolol is notorious for doing the opposite in drying out the body and making the athlete appear leaner. And this is actually completely true, since one of the main medical uses for stanozolol is for chronic anti-angioedema, which is the type of swelling that usually happens with allergic reactions, except often over an entire lifespan and without clear causes. In these cases, stanozolol is deployed as it seems to very well reduce the fluid buildup beneath the skin. So you can imagine why bodybuilders like to use it at closer competitions, but it also provides value for other athletes needing to remain as light as possible for the weight classes and enhancing speed and explosiveness through lack of excess body weight. In this study, patients who had used stanozolol for the anti-angioedema treatment were asked about their uses and side effects. The lowest amount of time the drug had been used for was 23 years, and reported side effects were quite minimal, especially if you filter out female patients. But it is worth noting that the average dose used here was only 2 mg every day, whereas most athletes usually consider 20 mg every day to be a low dose, so side effects are likely to be more of an issue at the doses considered for performance enhancement. And these side effects, as we said before, are pretty much exactly what you'd expect from a DHT derivative androgen. Increased red blood cell production and blood pressure, although not normally as extreme as Anadrol, virilization, which is the development of male characteristics in young males or females like body hair or facial hair growth, deepening of the voice, menstrual disruption, hair thinning, essentially the effects that are aimed at when transitioning from female to male through androgen therapy. Liver toxicity due to the oral nature, although the actual extent of the toxicity is debatable since those patients in the study had been using it for a very long time with no notable liver issues, albeit at a much lower dose. So liver toxicity may be an issue, but if you are sensible with the usage and limited other lifestyle factors that would also stress the liver, like excessive alcohol consumption, the risk may be manageable, especially if you regularly check the liver's condition. Stanozolol also prevents cardiovascular risk aside from raising blood pressure and red blood cell count by increasing lipid deposition in the arteries, which may lead to atherosclerosis, which constricts the vessels and potentially blocks the passage of blood, leading to myocardial infarction or heart attacks or strokes. Hair loss in males may be another risk of stanozolol, but the specifics are unknown. But it is important to step back and realize that if you are prone to male pattern baldness, you will almost certainly at some point, whether or not you are using anabolic steroids, begin to lose hair. So while using steroids may accelerate this event, it isn't causing it where it wouldn't be initially, so it is really something you would need to consider as a when rather than an if. In regards to the specific effects of stanozolol on tendon strength and development, the data is so far quite inconsistent. There are some studies that seem to suggest that anabolic steroids in general are deleterious to tendon repair and strength, but conversely, anabolic steroids are being used in patients following injury to the tendons. This study collects a lot of the existing studies and highlights the inconsistencies and potential flaws with many of the studies that emphasize the negative effects on the connective tissue, and generally seem to conclude that heavy resistance training in combination with anabolic steroid use over a long period of time seems to produce the strongest and thickest tendons. And it's no hidden fact that stanozolol is very popular in elite strength and power sports like sprinting and weightlifting, which we can see from the positive doping results alone. So while the information is sparse and inconclusive, there does not seem to be much of a negative impact on athletic performance through the use of stanozolol. So to wrap things up, the basic template is simply a lower dose of testosterone, or as much as you individually can tolerate without conversion into DHT or estrogens emerging, and then on top of that, specifically for force production, stanozolol due to its relative efficiency. But stanozolol really does not need to be used constantly. With testosterone alone, you will be in a constant state of anabolism and heightened androgenic activity, so you are going to be progressing with that alone. If you have periods of need for extra strength, like specific blocks of training, then this would be the time to deploy the extra support to allow you to get more from that specific period of training, which will probably last 2 or 3 months at most. If you have more need for gaining size over strength, then that is really another question with other routes probably more tailored towards. Why are we not looking at drugs like Nandrolone or Boldenone as alternatives? Simply because they don't really provide what we are asking for here and invite further issues by adding more exotic compounds into the mix. Furthermore, Nandrolone in particular in this study was shown to be one of the most neurotoxic anabolic steroids available, with Trenbolone sitting at around the same level. However, Stanozolol was shown to be, from the steroids compared, the least neurotoxic. In a sport where response to situations and tactical movements are highly important, like arm wrestling, abusing drugs which impair recognition memory is going to have a large negative impact on performance. So these drugs, where the main benefit they provide is an increase in muscle mass more than specific performance, they just don't seem to add much value to the conversation. If we venture outside of only anabolic steroids, then yes, there may be a few more things available that provide value. For example, human growth hormone, which, unlikely to do much directly for strength, will be very beneficial to the repair and strengthening of connective tissue. However, use of that invites more side effects, including increased insulin resistance, so for a lot of people who abuse growth hormone, using insulin on top becomes more important to be able to control the flow of glucose in the bloodstream. So while these other avenues will hold some value, they are outside of the scope of this discussion and require further expanding upon in specificity. And that's about it for this video, I suppose. I hope this has at least shone some light onto what is going on with the use of anabolic steroids, and potentially ways that they could be used to be more effective and less health damaging. But that's it, and I'll see you next time.